Cheyenne Irwin. I'm 38 years old, a financial analyst by trade, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the quiet backbone of my family, not the loudest voice at the dinner table, but the one making sure the bills are paid, the investments are sound, and when things go sideways, as they often do, I'm the steady hand keeping everything afloat. Growing up, I always had a knack for numbers and a head for details. That's what led me into finance, where I've spent over a decade honing my skills. I'm the kind of person who finds comfort in spreadsheets and balance sheets, not drama or confrontation. Outside of work, I live a modest life. My house isn't extravagant, just a comfortable place where my husband Eric, our 2 kids, and I can feel safe and grounded. I'm not flashy, and I don't crave attention, but the truth is, my quiet life hasn't stopped me from supporting my family through some of their toughest times. My family, the Irwins, have always been complicated beneath the surface. On the outside, we look like the typical hardworking clan: Sunday dinners, holidays, celebrations, but behind the scenes, it's a different story. I've been the one managing the money when things got tight, advising my siblings and parents on financial decisions, even lending out what I could to help keep family ventures alive. Not because I wanted praise or recognition, but because that's what families do, right? You help each other. Or at least that's what I thought. Despite all of that, tension always seemed to hover around our family gatherings. It's like the air would thicken with undercurrents of frustration and unspoken resentments. I started noticing subtle changes over the past year. Invites to family events becoming sparse, side conversations trailing off when I entered the room, even the way my sister Allison would avoid making eye contact. It was the kind of exclusion you don't always catch right away, but the feeling builds up, like a slow burn in your chest. Then came the call that unsettled everything. Allison rang me out of the blue, excitement barely contained in her voice, to tell me about a new family compound they'd built, a sprawling estate with 5 houses, she gushed. A place she said was meant to bring us all closer together. But there was a strange edge to her words, almost like she was testing how I'd react. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I remember sitting on the edge of my couch after that call, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Because if there was a compound, a literal fortress of family unity, where was I in all of this? Was I invited? Did they want me there? Or was this new chapter in our family story being written without me? I've always believed that blood ties meant something, that loyalty and support were the invisible threads that keep families connected through storms. But lately, those threads have felt more like chains, binding me to a version of family where my efforts count for less and less. My instincts told me things were shifting, but hearing about the compound was like a loud knock on the door of a quiet room. Suddenly, I was forced to confront a truth I wished I could ignore. So here I am, trying to make sense of it all, navigating the complicated dance of love and betrayal, trust and distance. I want to share this journey, not just for myself, but for anyone who's ever been the family's silent supporter, only to find themselves pushed out of the picture. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't losing money or status, it's losing your place at the table you built with your own hands. Growing up, the favoritism was impossible to miss, even if I tried. Allison was always the golden child, the one who charmed everyone effortlessly. I remember how my parents' eyes would light up when Allison performed in school plays or brought home awards, as if the world itself had conspired to shower her with praise. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one in the background, the kid who did her homework, helped out without complaint, and never quite measured up to those sparkling moments. It wasn't that Allison was any more talented or deserving. It was just that she fit the mold they wanted. Outgoing, socially adept, always the center of attention. I, on the other hand, was bookish, reserved, the steady but unremarkable sibling who quietly bore the weight of expectations without ever drawing notice. I remember one birthday party from when we were teenagers. Allison had invited her entire cheerleading squad, a glossy group of classmates who laughed and danced as if life were a never-ending celebration. I sat in the corner watching, holding a book, feeling invisible. When I tried to join the conversation, my voice would be drowned out, or worse, dismissed with a sideways glance. My parents would smile warmly at Allison, praising her at every opportunity, while I was expected to fade into the background without complaint. This pattern followed me into adulthood. Allison was the favored heir to family opportunities, whether it was an internship at Dad's business or the chance to study abroad. Doors opened for her with ease. Me? I had to work twice as hard just to get a nod of approval, and even then, my achievements were quietly overlooked. I learned not to voice disappointments or ask for recognition. It was easier to keep my head down and do the work. The emotional toll was subtle but persistent. I became the scapegoat for minor family disputes. If something went wrong, it was easier to blame me than to confront Allison's mistakes. I'd quietly take the blame, absorbing the frustration and anger, trying to keep the peace. I remember one holiday dinner when a misunderstanding about a missing invoice spiraled into a full-blown argument. Allison's mistake was glossed over. I was left holding the weight of the fallout, apologizing even though I wasn't at fault. The familiar sting of unfairness settled like a heavy fog. Despite all this, I convinced myself that my financial contributions might be different, that maybe, just maybe, money would earn me a seat at the table. I poured my energy into managing the family's finances, keeping track of investments, and lending money when ventures faltered. I reasoned that if I could prove my worth through practical support, through the numbers and the bottom line, they couldn't ignore me forever. I held on to the hope that loyalty and hard work would eventually break down the invisible barriers. But looking back, I see how normalized this emotional manipulation was. The family's affection felt transactional, conditional on my silence and compliance. When I pushed for inclusion or acknowledgement, I was met with cold reminders that family is complicated, or that I was too sensitive. Over time, these subtle messages eroded my sense of belonging. I stopped expecting fairness and instead learned to mask my hurt behind smiles and reassurances. Even the family business was a minefield of exclusion. Decisions were made in hushed meetings where my presence wasn't requested, as if I were a guest in my own heritage. When Allison and Mark would discuss new ventures, they'd share updates with my parents, but rarely with me. Yet, when the ventures faced setbacks, I was expected to step in and stabilize the finances, plugging holes that no one else acknowledged. This favoritism wasn't just about love or attention. It was a power play, a way to control family dynamics while keeping me in my place. Allison's insecurities fueled her need to dominate, and Mark's loyalty to her often meant sidelining me further. Dad's charisma masked a calculating mind, one that kept the family's greed carefully hidden behind a veneer of charm. Mom, ever the peacekeeper, often turned a blind eye to these undercurrents, choosing denial over confrontation. I rationalized and justified it all for years, telling myself that family loyalty means sacrifice, that love sometimes looks messy but is there beneath the surface. I believed that my quiet endurance was a form of strength, that my financial support was the thread holding us together. But deep down, I felt the sharp edges of exclusion, like an outsider watching a family dance where my steps were never quite right, no matter how hard I tried. Those childhood patterns set the stage for everything that followed, making me vulnerable to being taken for granted and exploited. And as the years passed, the line between support and sacrifice blurred until I could no longer tell if I was helping my family or being used by them. I've always believed that family means sacrifice, but looking back, I realized just how much I gave, often without much acknowledgement or thanks. There were moments when I put my own dreams and career ambitions on hold to keep the family running, especially when it came to caring for my aging grandmother. Grandma had been the matriarch before my parents took over, and when her health started to decline, I was the one who stepped in. While Allison pursued her social life and Mark focused on their business interests, I rearranged my schedule to be her primary caregiver. It wasn't easy, balancing late nights at work with doctor's appointments, managing medications, and making sure she had everything she needed. I didn't complain, though. It felt like the right thing to do. That sacrifice extended beyond time and energy. I also quietly loaned the family money multiple times to keep various ventures afloat. When Dad's business faced a downturn and urgent repairs were needed at the family properties, I put up what I could without hesitation. The sums weren't small. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes, drawn from years of savings and investments I'd worked tirelessly to build. I trusted that these injections of cash were temporary, that they would be repaid, or at least acknowledged. But more often than not, the money disappeared into the family's tangled financial web with little fanfare. One particular instance still haunts me. It was during the year when Allison decided to launch that boutique event planning company. She was passionate, no doubt, and I wanted to support her ambition. When the initial investment needed was more than she had, I stepped in with a loan from my own settlement funds. I remember the day I wired the money, feeling a mix of pride and quiet hope. I told myself this was family helping family, but the repayments were never tracked. And when profits started rolling in, I wasn't consulted or offered a share. Instead, Allison's business grew under the family name while I remained the silent financier, my contributions invisible to everyone but me. Beyond loans, I managed countless crises behind the scenes. When the family tax filings got complicated, I was the one who stayed up late poring over forms, ensuring compliance and minimizing liabilities. When unexpected debts emerged, I scrambled to find solutions, often negotiating with creditors on their behalf. I was the go-to person when things went south, the emergency fixer when plans derailed. But the emotional strain was just as heavy. My husband Eric witnessed these sacrifices firsthand, and while he supported me, he wasn't immune to the strain either. Our family dinners sometimes dissolved into quiet conversations about the toll my divided loyalties were taking. My children noticed too. There were times I worked late into the night at home while they waited for my attention. The tension of balancing my own family's needs with the demands of my extended family was exhausting. Despite all this, Allison and Mark often dismissed my contributions as simply what Cheyenne does. They saw my financial support and caregiving not as exceptional acts of kindness, but as expected duties, part of my role as the responsible sibling. Allison would brush off my concerns, insinuating that since I was so good with money, managing the family's finances was just natural for me. Mark's attitude wasn't far off. He sometimes implied that I was trying to control or overshadow their decisions by keeping tight reins on the money. I remember one heated exchange after a particularly stressful family meeting. I suggested that we formalize some agreements to avoid future misunderstandings about money and responsibilities. Allison's eyes narrowed, and with a sharp tone she said, "You don't need to make things complicated, Cheyenne. We're family. We just do what's best." Mark chimed in, accusing me of trying to micromanage everything. It stung because all I wanted was transparency and fairness. But even with that rejection, I held on to hope. I told myself my financial support was a bridge, something that would eventually build trust and inclusion. I believed that if I kept giving, kept helping hold the family together when it threatened to fall apart, my place at the table would be secure. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can see how my quiet endurance was taken for granted. The family's affection felt transactional, like a ledger with emotional debts that I was expected to pay without question. When I pushed for recognition or respect, I was met with phrases like, "Family is complicated," or told I was too sensitive, words that effectively shut down deeper conversation. But the most painful part was being excluded from the very decisions I helped finance. I wasn't invited to key meetings about the family business, or the investments that were supposed to benefit us all. I found out about some ventures only after they were underway, expected to step in only if things went wrong. Meanwhile, Allison and Mark would discuss future plans in hushed tones, leaving me outside the loop, despite my financial stake. The pattern was clear. I was the family's financial safety net, but not a full member of the decision-making circle. Allison's insecurities and need to dominate, married to Mark's loyalty to her, ensured I was kept on the sidelines. Dad's charm veiled his calculating nature, and Mom's desire to keep peace often meant ignoring the tension rather than addressing it. I tried to convince myself this was just how families operated, that my sacrifices were part of love. But the line between support and exploitation blurred until I couldn't tell if I was helping my family or being used by them. And that uncertainty has been the heaviest burden of all. The day of the family reunion arrived with an unsettling weight hanging over me. It was supposed to be a celebration, a chance to reconnect, to remind ourselves that despite everything, we were family. Instead, it felt like stepping into a carefully scripted play where I wasn't quite sure of my role anymore. We gathered at the old community center, a place that held a strange mix of nostalgia and awkwardness. The air was thick with the smell of fried chicken, freshly baked pies, and the faint tang of spilled soda. Kids darted around, laughter echoing, but beneath the surface was the low hum of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. I tried to keep my smile genuine, but my heart was pounding with trepidation. Allison was the first to take center stage. She wore that confident, radiant smile that always seemed so effortless, the kind that commanded attention without even asking for it. She launched into a grand announcement about the family's latest venture, a sprawling compound with 5 houses. A dream come true, she said. Her voice was bright, almost triumphant, as she described the compound as a symbol of family unity, a new chapter where we could all come together under one roof. But the way she spoke, it was like a performance rehearsed 1,000 times over. The crowd hung on her every word, nodding and applauding, but my stomach twisted as I noticed one glaring omission: my name. Not once did she mention how the project was funded, or acknowledge the countless hours I had spent managing the funds behind the scenes. I forced myself forward after her speech, heart pounding in my ears, trying to sound casual. So, when do you think we'll all get to see this place? My voice wavered slightly, betraying my nerves. Allison smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, Cheyenne. It's a private family retreat now. It's going to be a special place for us. Just the immediate family. You know, to keep things simple. I blinked, trying to process what she just said. But I helped fund that project. With my settlement money, I thought this was supposed to be for all of us. Her smile tightened, and Mark stepped in quickly. His tone clipped. Cheyenne, you're overthinking it. This isn't about you. The money was pooled, and it's being managed by Dad and Allison. You can't just expect to have a say. I felt the room shift around me, cold eyes glancing away, murmurs swirling just out of earshot. My voice cracked when I pressed again. So, I'm not invited to visit the compound? Even though my money built it? Leonard appeared, his charismatic grin thin and forced. We're trying to protect the family's harmony, Cheyenne. It's complicated. You need to understand that sometimes tough decisions are necessary. The words hit like a slap. Tough decisions? Excluding me? Using my money without telling me? That's what you call family harmony? The room grew quiet, and Allison's gaze hardened. You're making this about money and control again. We're building something for the family's future. If you can't see that, maybe you're the one causing the problem. I swallowed the lump in my throat, the sting of betrayal burning sharp and raw. Their indifference, no, their calculated dismissal, left me reeling. The compound wasn't just a symbol of unity. It was a fortress built around me, with walls I wasn't allowed to cross. Still, a small part of me clung to hope. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe I could find a way back in. But as I looked around and saw the guarded faces, the whispered alliances, I realized this was something far deeper. The exclusion wasn't accidental. It was intentional, and it was painful. I left that reunion feeling smaller, erased in a room meant for family. The compound wasn't just a new home. It was a barricade, and I was standing outside, looking in. The shock hit me like a freight train the day I found out the full extent of their betrayal. It wasn't just that they'd spent my $1.5 million accident settlement without my knowledge. It was that they'd gone even further. They had actually banned me from setting foot on the family compound, the sprawling estate with 5 houses they'd built using that money, and all under the pretense of protecting family harmony. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across my laptop screen as I scrolled through an email from a local attorney I'd contacted to help me understand the documents Allison's husband had sent. The papers outlined the ownership structure of the new compound. My name was nowhere to be found. Instead, the property was held under a trust that clearly excluded me. Worse, there was a formal letter, an official notice, from Leonard, my father, stating that I was no longer permitted to visit or use any part of the property. The cold, clinical language of the letter felt like a punch straight to my chest. I reread the letter over and over, trying to make sense of the words. This decision has been made in the interest of preserving peace and family harmony. Your presence at the compound is no longer welcomed or appropriate. The phrase family harmony echoed mockingly in my mind. Was it harmony to confiscate the very place I helped build? Harmony to shut me out and erase my role? That evening, I confronted Allison in a phone call that quickly turned into a battle of wills. Her voice was smooth and controlled, but icy beneath the surface. "Cheyenne, this isn't personal. We had to make tough calls. You've been unpredictable, and everyone agrees this is best for the family," she said, her tone sharp but rehearsed. I swallowed my hurt and tried to reason with her. Unpredictable? Because I asked about the money that funded the compound? Because I want to be included, not shut out? She sighed, a sound full of impatience. "You don't get to dictate how we manage things, especially when you've been so difficult. Leonard's made the decision, and you need to accept it." I felt my chest tighten, the betrayal burning hotter than I could remember. Difficult? I've been the one holding everything together. Without me, you and Mark wouldn't have had a dime to build that place. There was silence on the other end, a pause thick enough to taste. Then Allison's voice dropped, colder than before. "That settlement was yours to spend, Cheyenne, but you never gave us permission. You can't just claim ownership. This is family business now, and you're out." The words felt like a verdict delivered by a jury that had already decided I was guilty of some crime I didn't commit. Not long after, I sought out Leonard, hoping to appeal to the father I once trusted. His charm was still intact, but the warmth I once knew was gone, replaced by a practiced distance. "Cheyenne, you have to understand the bigger picture," he said smoothly, sitting back in his leather chair, hands folded. "Your actions have caused discord. We're trying to protect the rest of the family." "Protect them from what? Me? From the truth?" I challenged, voice trembling but resolute. "I funded this compound. How can you ban me from visiting it? How is that protecting family?" He smiled, but it was more of a sneer. "Sometimes family means making sacrifices. Your pride is getting in the way of peace. You need to step back." I left that meeting with an ache deeper than any financial loss. It was the erasure of my contributions, of my place. A place I had fought to earn with every dollar and every sleepless night managing their chaos. Their indifference was a sharp knife twisting in my side, but what hurt most was the calculated exclusion. The compound wasn't just a house. It was a fortress they built using my trust and money, then locked me out of. Eric witnessed the fallout too. When I told him about the ban, I saw the disbelief in his eyes, the mix of anger and helplessness. "This isn't just about money, Cheyenne. They're cutting you off. They don't want you around," he said quietly, wrapping his arms around me. For the first time, I felt the isolation fully settle in. This was no longer about family loyalty. It was about betrayal. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of their rejection pressed down. The compound's walls, the grand estate I helped finance, loomed in my mind like a symbol of everything they'd taken without asking. I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was a deliberate act to erase me from their story. The sting of that exclusion was raw and personal. The very foundation of trust I'd built with my family was crumbling beneath me. Every smile during those Sunday dinners, every word of thanks that was never said, now rang hollow in my ears. I wasn't just being sidelined. I was being exiled. But beneath the pain, a new resolve began to stir. If they thought they could silence me by locking me out, they were wrong. I wouldn't let this betrayal define who I was or how my family history would be written. The chapter of exclusion was just beginning, and I knew I needed to find my voice, not just for me, but for the dignity I owed myself and my children. The compound, with its gleaming walls and sprawling grounds, stood as a monument to their greed and deceit, but I was no longer willing to stand outside its gates quietly. My fight was just starting. That night, as the house settled into silence, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the scattered papers before me. The letter banning me from the compound lay folded beside my trembling hands, a cold, unforgiving reminder of the walls I'd been shut out behind. Outside, the faint hum of the city felt distant, like a life I was no longer part of, or perhaps never really had been. Grief washed over me first, a heavy, suffocating weight that settled deep in my chest, making each breath a silent struggle. It wasn't just about the money. They'd taken that, yes. But the real wound was the betrayal from the people I'd called family, the ones I'd trusted with my secrets, my sacrifices, and my heart. The compound wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of everything I'd been denied: respect, acknowledgement, and most painfully, belonging. I replayed the years in my mind, the countless times I had put their needs above my own. I saw the long nights spent juggling work with caring for Grandma, the endless phone calls fielding their emergencies, the quiet transfers of money to keep their dreams afloat. I remembered the times I swallowed my hurt when Allison got the praise I craved, or when Mark dismissed my input as controlling. Each instance had felt like a pinprick, tiny on its own, but cumulatively piercing through my spirit. The phrase "family first" had been my mantra, whispered like a lullaby when doubt crept in. But now, that mantra felt like a bitter joke. Family first? If that were true, why was I the only one paying the price? Why was my loyalty met with silence, my generosity with exclusion? As the night deepened, my grief evolved into something colder, clearer, a sharp, icy clarity that cut through the haze of confusion and hurt. I began cataloging each sacrifice, each oversight, each moment where my trust was taken for granted. It was like peeling back layers of a carefully constructed illusion, revealing the raw, uncomfortable truth beneath. My family hadn't seen me as a partner or equal. I had been a tool, an emergency fund with a quiet smile, never a person deserving of voice or vote. That realization stung fiercely, but it also freed me. I understood now that their love was conditional, bound up in convenience and control. When I was useful, they welcomed me. When I asserted myself, they shut me out. The betrayal wasn't an accident, but a calculated move to keep me confined to the margins. They had built their fortress with my money, and then locked me out, treating me like an intruder rather than family. I thought about Eric and the kids, how much of my energy I'd spent trying to balance their needs with the demands of a family that didn't truly want me. The strain was unmistakable. Eric's quiet frustration during our late-night talks, the way my children sometimes looked at me, wondering why I was tired or distracted, it all made sense now. I had been stretched thin, trying to hold together a family that was tearing itself apart at my expense. A seed of resolve took root in that quiet kitchen. No longer would I allow their version of family to define my worth or dictate my boundaries. I owed myself more than silent sacrifice. I owed my children the example of dignity and self-respect. The betrayal had shattered the old illusions, but from those broken pieces, I could build something new, something stronger, something real. I whispered to the empty room, "They owe me nothing, but I owe myself respect." The words felt like a promise, both to myself and to the future I needed to claim. My fight wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my identity, my voice, and my peace. The compound, with its gleaming facades and locked gates, might stand as a monument to their greed, but it would no longer be a prison for me. Behind those walls, they had drawn their lines. Outside, I would draw mine, and with that cold clarity burning steady inside me, the path ahead, uncertain and fraught, began to take shape. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped being a silent victim and started being the author of my own fate. That night, I sat alone, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a physical force. After years of quietly supporting my family, I was suddenly confronted with the stark reality. The people I had trusted most had built their future on the foundation of my accident settlement, and then locked me out. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was financial, legal, and deeply strategic. If I was going to protect myself and my children, I needed to act with the same precision and care I'd always applied to managing money. I pulled the settlement paperwork from the drawer where I'd carefully stored it, the thick file of legal documents, statements, and correspondence that marked a turning point in my life. The $1.5 million was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to secure my family's future, and yes, to help those I loved. But now, I realized I had been naive to assume goodwill from a family that had quietly been siphoning my resources while excluding me from decisions. I needed to understand the legal boundaries and find a way to reclaim control. The first step was to consult someone outside the family circle, a trusted attorney whose reputation for integrity and thoroughness I respected. I made the call early the next morning, my voice steady but tinged with the urgency of someone navigating unfamiliar battlefield lines. Explaining the situation felt like reliving the betrayal all over again. The compound, the exclusion, the formal ban. But I knew I couldn't let emotion cloud the practicalities. During our meeting, we carefully reviewed every clause of the settlement documents. The attorney pointed out which funds were mine legally, and which parts had been mixed, either mistakenly or deliberately, into family accounts or ventures. I learned that while the settlement was awarded to me personally, the way the family had pooled it into shared investments without my informed consent was legally questionable. The trust holding the compound's title was structured in a way that deliberately excluded me, effectively erasing my ownership claims. My heart sank as the attorney outlined the steps I could take. It wasn't as simple as demanding my money back. There were complex issues of property law, trust management, and potential family litigation. But there was a path forward: securing my assets, formalizing my legal boundaries, and protecting myself from further unauthorized use. It was a cold, calculated process, but necessary. I left the meeting with a binder full of notes, a list of urgent actions, and a flicker of hope. I wasn't powerless. I could fight this, not with shouting or anger, but with strategy and precision. It was time to stop being the silent provider and start being an advocate for my own rights. Back at home, Eric noticed the shift immediately. The tiredness in my eyes was replaced by a quiet determination. When I shared the plan with him, his relief was palpable. He'd seen how much the family's betrayal had worn me down. Together, we discussed how to protect our children and create a buffer between our immediate family and the toxic dynamics that had taken root. I changed passwords on all our financial accounts, separating joint family ventures from our personal assets. I arranged for a separate financial advisor to oversee our portfolio, someone impartial who could keep an eye on any unusual activity. I also drafted a new will with my attorney, explicitly excluding the extended family who had betrayed my trust. It felt painful, like writing goodbye to people I still loved in some way, but necessary for my peace of mind. Quietly, I began compiling evidence, bank statements, emails, and texts, showing the unauthorized use of my settlement funds. I documented every interaction related to the compound's funding and ownership. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. If the family wanted to continue down this path, I would be ready. Around me, life kept moving. I maintained a calm facade during calls with Leonard and Allison, masking the storm of planning that was unfolding beneath the surface. They had no idea I was quietly dismantling the financial safety net they'd come to rely on. This gave me a small measure of control, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I also confided in a few close friends, people outside the family who I trusted implicitly. Their support was a balm against the isolation. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my worth wasn't defined by a family that chose exclusion over gratitude. As the days passed, the initial shock of betrayal slowly transformed into a focused mission. I wasn't just protecting my money. I was protecting my dignity, my future, and the example I wanted to set for my children. The family compound might be a fortress built on my sacrifice, but I was no longer going to stand outside its gates, powerless and silenced. Instead, I was stepping into a new role, one where I reclaimed my voice, drew clear boundaries, and prepared for the battle ahead with clear eyes and steady hands. The fight was just beginning. It started small at first, subtle shifts that I barely allowed myself to notice. I stopped answering the family's calls as quickly as I used to. Where before I'd jump at the ring of the phone, eager to help or just check in, now I let the calls go to voicemail. When I did call back, it was brief, careful, measured. The urgency I used to feel had dulled, replaced by a cautious detachment I hadn't experienced before. Money was always the language they understood, and it was the first place I pulled back. I began reducing the financial aid I'd been quietly funneling into family projects. Not all at once, but in incremental steps I hoped they'd notice. A few thousand less here, a delayed payment there. I started saying no to requests that weren't urgent or that felt like they were taking advantage. It was hard. Years of habit made it feel almost unnatural to withhold help, especially from those you love. But after everything, I realized the love I'd been showing wasn't reciprocated. It was time to protect myself. Family events, once a given on my calendar, became something I declined more often. Invitations grew scarce, but even when they came, I found reasons to stay home. Work deadlines, the kids' schedules, even just needing the space to breathe. I had to learn to say no, to prioritize my own family and sanity over a family that had repeatedly pushed me to the sidelines. When I declined, the silence on the other end of the invitation stung. It was like an unspoken, "We expected you wouldn't come," but I couldn't pretend anymore. My roles within the family structure, the one who managed the books, filed the taxes, smoothed the financial wrinkles, began to shift too. I stopped juggling their tax filings, no longer burning midnight oil to make sure their numbers looked good. The relief was immediate, but so was the ripple effect. Suddenly, the family faced complications they'd been able to avoid for years. I could almost feel the subtle tremors of panic that my withdrawal triggered, even if they didn't say it outright. Protecting my assets became a quiet, methodical process. I changed passwords on shared accounts, severed automatic transfers, and had my attorney update property titles to reflect my sole ownership where it was legally mine. These were small acts of reclaiming control, a way of setting up walls around what was rightfully mine after so many years of blurred boundaries. It felt like I was patching leaks in a dam I'd been hoping wouldn't break. Despite all this, I kept my composure. Around Leonard, Allison, and the rest, I wore my calm like armor. I didn't want to reveal the full extent of my withdrawal or the plans forming in the shadows. They remained oblivious, continuing to treat me as the dependable sister who would always step in. That illusion gave me a strategic advantage, a quiet power they underestimated. My silence spoke volumes, even as I acted decisively. The tension was palpable, even if it was beneath the surface. Family gatherings grew quieter, the once easy camaraderie replaced by stiff conversations and forced smiles. I noticed the way Allison would glance my way, suspicion flickering in her eyes, or how Mark would avoid discussing finances when I was around. But no one confronted me directly. They didn't dare. They couldn't afford to. Inside, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, relieved that I was finally setting boundaries, protecting myself and my children from any more harm. Sad because the family I'd held together was unraveling, and I was the one pulling the thread. It was a lonely place to be, standing firm against a tide of years of betrayal and neglect. But standing firm was exactly what I needed to do. This slow withdrawal unsettled the family in ways they wouldn't admit. They had grown accustomed to my presence, my support, my quiet strength. Now, with one foot out the door, I was rewriting the rules of our relationships. The compound, once a symbol of unity in their eyes, was becoming a battleground for power and respect, one I was no longer willing to lose by staying silent. And as I closed this chapter of quiet support behind me, the next one, where I would take control and demand accountability, was already taking shape in my mind. That day, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The weight of betrayal was suffocating, but beneath it burned a fierce determination. I wasn't just going to stand by while my family used my accident settlement to build their dream compound and then locked me out like an intruder. It was time to take control, and to make one thing crystal clear: the days of being the silent financial safety net were over. I began by drafting the ultimatum I knew they had to hear. I called Leonard first, my voice steady but firm. "Dad, we need to talk about the settlement funds, about the compound." He responded with his usual charm, trying to deflect. "Cheyenne, this isn't the time to stir drama. We're trying to move forward as a family." But I cut through the niceties. "You've built your future with my settlement money, Dad. and you've shut me out. That ends now." From there, I escalated the stakes. I formally notified Allison and Leonard in writing that I was cutting off all financial support immediately. Years of loans and bailouts, of managing their taxes and bank accounts would stop on my terms. No more unpaid debts, no more silent sacrifices. I drafted a letter with the help of my attorney, making it clear that until they acknowledged my contributions and treated me with respect, I would no longer be their lender, their advisor, or their backup plan. But I didn't stop there. I worked closely with my lawyer to amend my will, officially removing Leonard, Allison, Mark, and any other family members who had betrayed me. That legal step stung in a way I hadn't expected. It felt like cutting ties I had hoped would never fray that badly. Yet, I knew it was necessary to protect what was rightfully mine and to send a message. My generosity was never to be exploited again. The most crucial move, however, was exposing the unauthorized use of my settlement funds. I compiled a comprehensive dossier, bank statements, wire transfers, receipts, and legal documents that irrefutably showed my $1.5 million had been funneled into the family compound without my permission or knowledge. I sent this evidence to their attorney and to the trust overseeing the compound, demanding an official investigation and restitution. I remember the quiet intensity of that moment, sitting at my kitchen table late into the night, clicking send on emails that would shatter the illusion my family had constructed. The compound, their supposed symbol of unity, was now on shaky ground, built on shaky ethics and broken trust. When the family finally grasped the magnitude of my actions, the shock was palpable. Allison's confident composure cracked. Leonard's smooth demeanor faltered. I wasn't just cutting them off financially. I was exposing their deceit publicly, threatening the very foundation of their new estate. Yet even amidst the chaos, I remained calm and resolute. I told them plainly in a carefully worded message, access to the compound and any future support will require respect, honesty, and accountability. Until then, I'm done being taken for granted. Their panic was almost tangible. Suddenly, the family that once relied on my money and expertise was scrambling to patch holes I'd exposed. I could feel the power shift, the unspoken recognition that I was no longer just the dependable sister on call. I was a force demanding justice. Even as the dust began to settle, I stayed firm. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and setting boundaries that had long been ignored. The compound might stand tall with gleaming walls and manicured lawns, but its foundation was crumbling under the weight of truth. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this ultimatum was only the first act in a longer story, a story where I would no longer be silenced or sidelined, but heard and respected. The fight was just beginning, and this time, I was ready. The moment I delivered my ultimatum, the house of cards my family had built started to wobble violently. Suddenly, it wasn't just a whispered suspicion or a cold shoulder at family dinners. It was a full-blown crisis that rippled through every corner of the Irwin clan. The compound, once a proud emblem of unity and legacy, was quickly becoming a symbol of their unraveling. Almost immediately, Leonard and Allison became relentless. Their calls and messages flooded my phone like an unyielding storm. At first, the tone was almost conciliatory, peppered with apologies and pleas. Leonard's voice, usually so smooth and commanding, sounded strained when he said, "Cheyenne, please, this isn't what any of us wanted. We can fix this. Let's talk." But there was an undercurrent beneath that charm. Desperation, panic clawing beneath the surface. Allison's messages were a twisted mix of guilt and manipulation. "I never meant to hurt you, Cheyenne. Your family. Please don't do this to us," she'd text, only to follow it moments later with a sharp, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Think about what you're risking." Their words tried to pull me back into a story I was no longer willing to believe in, one where sacrifice meant silent suffering, where loyalty was taken for granted. Mark, their reluctant mediator, attempted to bridge the widening gap. His tone was more neutral, but firm. "Cheyenne, let's find common ground. This isn't good for anyone," he messaged, but I could hear the tension behind his words. Loyalty divided, caught between truth and family allegiance. Meanwhile, The financial cracks became impossible to ignore. Without my support, the quiet yet crucial safety net, they scrambled to cover bills and maintain appearances. I heard through mutual friends that the compound's maintenance fees were piling up, vendors left unpaid, and whispers of overdue mortgages began circulating. The sprawling estate, once gleaming and proud, was starting to feel like a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. I could almost visualize Leonard pacing his office late into the night, frustration etched into his face where charm once lived. Allison's confident facade cracked during family calls, her voice occasionally faltering under the weight of unraveling financial certainty. The golden child was no longer untouchable, now exposed and vulnerable without my backing. Their desperation gave rise to a barrage of mixed tactics. Leonard's voice would shift from pleading to accusing within the same conversation. "You're being selfish, Cheyenne. This isn't just about money. It's about family. We're trying to keep peace here, and you're tearing us apart." Allison's impassioned texts alternated between, "We need you. Please reconsider," and veiled threats. "If you keep this up, you'll regret it." Yet through it all, I stayed unmoved. Each attempt to guilt-trip or pressure me back into the fold only steeled my resolve. I responded with measured calm, setting clear boundaries. No more financial bailouts, no more silent sacrifices. They needed to understand that respect and accountability were the new terms of any future relationship. The fallout spread beyond just the immediate family. Extended relatives started whispering, wary of taking sides as rumors of legal battles, financial instability, and public disclosures surfaced. The carefully curated image of the Irwin clan began to crumble. Where once there was admiration, now there was skepticism and distance. I could sense Allison's frustration bubbling to the surface in private conversations I overheard through mutual contacts. The woman who once ruled family gatherings with effortless grace was now scrambling to maintain control, her insecurities laid bare. The panic was palpable when she realized the financial safety net she relied on was gone, and that her own ambitions might be at risk. Anger within the family grew in intensity, their usual tactics of passive aggression and subtle exclusion replaced by more overt attempts to discredit me. But I was no longer the silent victim. I documented every interaction, every message, every call. I prepared myself mentally and emotionally for the long road ahead. Despite the turmoil, I felt a strange clarity. The chaos that engulfed the Irwins was proof that their dependence on me had been profound, deeper than they'd ever admit openly. Their panic was a mirror reflecting the power shift I had ignited. For the first time in years, I felt the scales balancing, the invisible chains breaking, but the story wasn't over. The compound, the money, and the fractured family ties were still tangled in a web of conflict and unresolved pain. The fight for dignity and justice was just intensifying, and I was ready to meet it head-on. The reverberations of my ultimatum crashed through the Irwin family like a whirlwind, exposing fault lines that had been carefully hidden beneath polite smiles and well-rehearsed conversations. Almost overnight, the family's polished veneer began to crack, and with each crack, the weight of their dependence on me became painfully clear. Within days, the first signs of real trouble surfaced. Foreclosure notices appeared in the mailboxes connected to the compound. Stark, unyielding reminders of unpaid mortgages and looming financial disaster. I heard through the grapevine that vendors who had tended to the sprawling grounds and maintained the multiple houses were left without paychecks, their calls ignored or dodged. The compound, once a symbol of the family's unity and legacy, was rapidly turning into a liability, a burden they could no longer sustain without me. I felt a bitter mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication because they could no longer pretend they were financially independent, no longer dismiss my contributions as incidental. Sadness because the family I had quietly supported for years was unraveling right before my eyes, a slow-motion collapse that pained me more deeply than words could capture. Leonard, whose charm had often masked his manipulative streak, began to show cracks of desperation. A mutual friend relayed a story of how Leonard paced his study late one night, muttering curses beneath his breath, the line between control and chaos blurred in his eyes. His carefully crafted image as the patriarch was faltering, replaced by the raw stress of a man whose financial fortress was crumbling. Allison's golden facade was also fading fast. Once the indomitable, golden child, she struggled to mask her panic during family calls. Friends told me she snapped at Mark during a recent meeting, her voice rising in frustration over missed payments and budget shortfalls. Her usual confidence gave way to anxiety, her veneer cracking as the reality of their precarious position sank in. The family's financial security, propped up by my steady hand, was disappearing beneath their feet. Mark, often the loyal supporter of Allison's ambitions, found himself caught in the crossfire. His attempts to mediate between me and the others became more strained by the day. In private messages, he urged for calm and compromise, but the tension between loyalty to his sister and the truth I had revealed pulled him in opposite directions. The family's response was a volatile mix of guilt, anger, and desperation. Leonard's tones swung wildly, from pleading for understanding to bitter accusations. In one phone call, he accused me of selfishness and destroying the family. Allison's messages alternated between heartfelt apologies and veiled threats, imploring me to reverse course while hinting at consequences if I did not. Yet, through it all, I stood firm. My replies were calm, but unequivocal. I made it clear that their survival depended on respect and accountability, not manipulation and exploitation. I would no longer be their silent financial crutch, their invisible backbone propping up their dreams while my own were sidelined. This upheaval didn't stay confined to our immediate family. Extended relatives, once enthusiastic participants in the family's grand vision, began to distance themselves. Rumors of legal actions and financial mismanagement circulated quietly but persistently. The Irwins' once stellar reputation started to falter, and invitations to social events dwindled. The ripple effects of my actions were reshaping the family's social and financial landscape. Allison's frustration and vulnerability became more evident in whispered conversations with mutual acquaintances. The woman who had long dominated family gatherings was now scrambling to maintain footing, her insecurities laid bare for all to see. She was desperate to regain control but lacked the financial support and influence she once wielded effortlessly. As their anger grew, so too did their attempts to discredit me. Passive aggression gave way to more direct jabs. Subtle character attacks and whispered rumors meant to undermine my credibility. But I was no longer the quiet sister who would internalize slights or stand by silently. I meticulously documented every insult, every manipulative message, every attempt to twist the narrative. I knew I needed a full record should this spiral further. Despite the chaos engulfing the Irwins, I felt a strange clarity settle over me, a resolve sharpened by years of quiet sacrifice and recent betrayal. Their panic was a mirror, reflecting the seismic shift I had ignited. They were no longer the family that relied on me without acknowledgement. They had been confronted with their own dependence and had nowhere left to hide. Still, even as the family's world trembled, I understood that the battle was far from over. The compound, the money, and the complex web of betrayal and pain that had defined our relationships were still deeply entangled. There were conversations yet to be had, reckonings yet to unfold, but I was no longer afraid. The fight for my dignity, my voice, and my peace had only just begun. And this time, I was ready. The air was thick with a quiet tension the morning I sat down to define exactly what I would and wouldn't accept moving forward. It was more than just drawing a line in the sand. It was about claiming my voice, my dignity, and my space in a family that had long treated me like an afterthought. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that if I didn't set clear terms now, I'd be risking the same cycle of betrayal all over again. Sitting at my kitchen table, the soft hum of the city swirling outside my window, I laid out what I needed from them: mutual respect, honesty, and equitable treatment. No more silent sacrifices where my contributions were ignored or taken for granted. No more financial dealings behind closed doors that excluded me despite my stake. No more emotional manipulation disguised as family harmony. This was non-negotiable. I drafted a letter, firm but fair, outlining these boundaries. It was the kind of message I wished I had received from them years ago. one that recognized my worth as not just the family's banker or caretaker, but as a full member entitled to respect and transparency. I held the letter in my hands, feeling a mixture of empowerment and grief. Empowerment because I was finally standing up for myself. Grief because these words marked a fracture in relationships I desperately wanted to mend. It quickly became clear that my focus had to shift inward, to Eric and our children, those who had stood beside me without question. They were my anchor when the family storm raged, the safe harbor where I could shed the weight of expectation and betrayal. Eric's quiet support was a lifeline, his presence a reminder that family could also mean safety and unconditional love. Our children, too, were part of this new beginning, a future where they would learn the importance of self-respect and boundaries, not silent endurance. I began to rebuild around that core. Our home, our routines, our celebrations. Sunday dinners, once heavy with unspoken resentments, were transformed into moments of genuine connection with Eric and the kids, and close friends who had proven their loyalty over time. The laughter was softer, the conversations deeper, free from the shadows of past betrayals. Yet the compound, the sprawling estate built with my settlement money, remained a stark symbol of all that had been lost. It stood like a monument to fractured trust, its gleaming walls a reminder that blood ties alone could not guarantee inclusion or respect. I couldn't erase what had happened, but I could redefine what family meant for me now. I understood that healing would not be linear, nor guaranteed. The Irwins faced a choice: to confront their mistakes with honesty and change, or to cement the estrangement that I had no intention of tolerating any longer. I extended the door for reconciliation only under conditions that honored my dignity. No more hidden agendas, no more exclusion, no more betrayal. In the quiet moments, I reflected on how far I'd come, from the quiet enabler of family dysfunction to a woman who demanded to be seen, heard, and treated justly. I wasn't the same person who once believed that giving everything silently would secure her place. I was stronger now, wiser, and fiercely protective of my own peace. The boundaries I set were not about punishment, but preservation, preserving my self-worth, my family's future, and the respect that had long been denied. I was no longer willing to be the invisible foundation beneath their house of cards. Instead, I was building a new foundation, one grounded in respect, clarity, and love chosen freely, not taken for granted. The lesson I carry with me, etched in every decision, is simple yet profound. Respect can't be bought with money, nor forced through blood alone. It must be earned, given, and reciprocated. And if it's not, then sometimes the bravest choice is to walk away, not as a failure, but as a woman reclaiming her own story. So, here I stand, not outside the gates of that compound anymore, but on the threshold of a new chapter, one where I define my own family, my own peace, and my own future. The fight for respect is ongoing, but now, I face it on my own terms, surrounded by those who truly see me. And that makes all the difference.